The hum was the first thing Anya Sharma ever remembered, a low, constant vibration that lived in the ice of Triton and resonated deep in your bones. A lullaby sung by 1,000 tons of machinery chewing through the moon's frozen mantle. It was the sound of life, the sound of progress, the sound of her father's hands, calloused and stained with hydraulic fluid, teaching her how to read the soul of a machine not by its schematics, but by the tenor of its song. She was a salvager, a junker, a scrap hauler's daughter raised in the pressurized warrens of Lowell City, which was less a city and more a collection of interconnected modules bolted to the underside of a vast ice shelf. Her world was a spectrum of grays and blues, the flat gray of repurposed alloy plating, and the deep, impossible blue of Neptune hanging in the sky like a silent, judging god. She knew the guts of every rig on the moon, from the lumbering cryo-excavators that scraped methane ice from the plains to the nimble asteroid tugs that danced in orbit, their magnetic tethers casting invisible nets for rogue chunks of rock and derelict satellites. No, her job was to keep the past running, to strip wires from dead consoles and weld plates over failing hulls. A constant battle against entropy fought with a plasma torch and a string of curses her father would have been proud of. Life was hard, air was rationed, and fresh food was a myth whispered by old-timers who remembered Earth. But it was their life, carved out here in the cold, silent dark, at the edge of the solar system. No one bothered them. Earth was too far, Mars too self-important. They were the forgotten outpost, the last stop for the lonely, and they liked it that way. The quiet was broken on a Tuesday, or what passed for a Tuesday, in a place where the sun was just the brightest star in a sea of endless diamonds. The system-wide alert wasn't a klaxon or a siren, nothing so dramatic. It was a simple, chilling chime that echoed from every public address system and personal comm link, a sound reserved for catastrophic depressurization or solar flare warnings. But the sky wasn't burning, and the pressure gauges were steady. Instead, the void outside the main viewport of the salvage depot began to change. It didn't tear open or shimmer with the garish light of a jump drive. It simply filled up. One moment, there was just Neptune and the infinite black. The next, there were ships. They weren't warships, not in any sense humanity understood. They were bone white, sterile, impossibly large, shaped like surgical tools or the polished femurs of long-dead giants. There were no visible weapon ports, no menacing angles, just smooth, unbroken surfaces that reflected the faint starlight with an unnerving placidity. Then came the broadcast, overriding every channel. A voice that was neither male nor female, a calm, synthesized tone that spoke in perfect, unaccented Terran standard. It wasn't a declaration of war, it was an audit. This broadcast is issued by the administrative authority of the Vord Consortium, the voice announced, its placid tone more terrifying than any scream. As per Galactic Charter 7, Subsection 4, Unclaimed Resource Territories, the Sol system and all biological and mineral assets therein have been identified as underdeveloped and fallow, effective immediately. The consortium has initiated a process of compulsory acquisition and resource liquidation. All sentient assets are instructed to report to designated processing hubs for valuation and reassignment. Non-compliance will be registered as spoilage and will be written off accordingly. We thank you for your cooperation. Anya stood frozen in the depot, a half-repaired servitor arm dangling from its gantry beside her. Spoilage. That's what they were. An asset to be liquidated, or waste to be discarded. Around her, the usual clatter of the workshop had died, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Men and women stood like statues, faces pale in the glow of welding arcs and diagnostic screens. Then the white ships began to calve smaller vessels, sleek white dropships that descended upon Lowell City, not with fire and plasma, but with a silent, inexorable grace. They landed in the main plazas, their ramps lowering to disgorge figures that moved with the same sterile efficiency as their ships. They were called auditors. Tall, slender beings encased in white armor that seemed to absorb the light around them. They carried no rifles, only long, silver batons that hummed with a low energy field. There was no battle, not really. The Lowell City Security Force, a handful of retired miners with stun batons, and a single, ancient kinetic pulse turret, was neutralized in under a minute. The auditors didn't kill them. They simply touched them with the batons, and the men collapsed, twitching, their nervous systems overloaded. It was a hostile takeover, not an invasion. The auditors moved through the warrens with a methodical calm, their movements coordinated, their purpose absolute. They didn't shout orders, they gestured, and automated drones swarmed ahead, tagging every human with a small, adhesive disc that glowed either red, yellow, or green. Red for immediate processing, yellow for skilled labor, green for domestic reassignment. Anya watched from a ventilation shaft she had slipped into, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw her shift foreman, a big, bluff man named Jorvik, who could tear a man in two, get tagged yellow and herded towards a dropship like cattle, his face a mask of confusion and terror. She saw a young couple from the hydroponics bay, clutching their small child. The parents tagged yellow, the child tagged green. An auditor separated them, its movements fluid and unhurried, ignoring the mother's screams as it handed the child to a floating nursery drone. The screams were the only thing that felt real. Everything else was a nightmare of silent, bureaucratic horror. Anya knew she had to run, not to fight, not to be a hero, but simply to not be cataloged. Her entire life had been spent crawling through the forgotten guts of this moon, the miles of abandoned mining tunnels and service conduits that the official schematics no longer showed. She moved through the darkness like a ghost, the hum of the moon her only guide, the distant, muffled screams a spur at her heels. She ran for hours, deeper and deeper into the cold, silent rock, until the sounds of the acquisition faded and she was left alone with the groaning of the ice and the frantic pounding of her own blood. In a forgotten substation, 3 miles beneath the surface, she found others. There were only a dozen of them, a motley collection of scared faces lit by the beam of a single hand lamp. Elias Vance was there, the old, grizzled chief of security, the one who'd been on a deep patrol when the auditors arrived. He had a nasty burn along his arm where a drone had grazed him, but his eyes were like chips of flint. He was looking at a schematic he'd scratched into the frost on a metal bulkhead. "They're systematic," he rasped, his voice rough. "They're clearing the city level by level. They'll start strip mining operations within a day. They'll find us." A young geologist, barely out of his teens, was shaking. "What do we do? We can't fight them." "No," Vance said, his gaze hard. "We can't, but we're not going to be some number on a manifest either." That's when Anya saw it, tucked away in an old docking bay connected to the substation, a place that hadn't been used in 50 years. It was the stray dog, an old Series 4 asteroid tug, a relic from the first colonization wave. It was a piece of junk, stripped of most of its key components, its hull scarred and pitted. But it was a ship. Its fusion core was cold. Its navigation system was a nest of dead wires. But its bones were good. Anya knew its bones. She had crawled over every inch of its sister ships in the salvage yard. "I can make it fly," she said, the words coming out before she'd even thought them through. All eyes turned to her. Vance raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That thing's a coffin." "It's a coffin with an engine," Anya countered, her voice gaining strength. She walked toward the derelict ship, her hands running over the cold metal as if greeting an old friend. "The primary reactor is shot, but the emergency power cells are just drained, not dead. We can recharge them from the station's grid. The nav computer is fried, but the manual thruster controls are analog. I can bypass the main console and wire them directly." She was no longer a scared salvager hiding in the dark. She was a mechanic. This was a machine, and she knew its language. For the next 18 hours, they worked in a frantic, whispered frenzy. Anya was the heart of the operation, directing the others, her voice sharp and clear as she called out commands. They cannibalized every piece of working tech in the substation, stripping wires, siphoning coolant, jury-rigging power conduits. Vance, meanwhile, taught the geologists and mechanics how to fight, not to win, but to die well. He showed them how to turn mining drills into breaching tools and how to overload power packs to create makeshift grenades. It was ugly, desperate work. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford, but purpose was a powerful fuel. As Anya worked deep within the tug's engine room, wrestling a heavy power converter into place, Vance came to her. He held up a schematic of the consortium's orbital processing station, a massive, ringed structure that now hung where only empty space had been before. "Getting out is one thing," he said quietly, "but they'll just track us. We'll be a loose asset they need to reclaim." Anya wiped grease from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a dark smear. "So we run fast." "Or," Vance said, his finger tapping the schematic, "we give them something else to worry about." He pointed to a section of the tug's design, the magnetic tether projector on the stray dog. It was an obsolete model, a massive electromagnetic coil designed to latch onto and tow asteroids weighing thousands of tons. It was a tool of industry, a workhorse. "What about it?" Anya asked. "The power output on that thing is insane," Vance murmured, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You said you could bypass the safeties." "Right. Overcharge the core." Anya's blood ran cold as she understood. "You're not thinking of towing something. You want to use it as a weapon." "They think we're livestock," Vance snarled, his voice a low growl. "They're up there right now, processing our friends, our families, putting them in cages and shipping them off like grain. They don't expect the cattle to have teeth." The idea was insane. A suicide run. To use an unarmed, derelict salvage tug to attack a state-of-the-art orbital station. But as Anya looked from Vance's hard, determined face to the schematics of the tug, a different kind of fire began to burn in her gut. It wasn't hope. It was rage. A cold, quiet fury that had been simmering beneath the fear. They had called her an asset. They had called her friends spoilage. They had taken her home, her life, the very hum of the moon she had grown up with, and replaced it with the sterile silence of compliance. Her father had taught her to respect machines, but he had also taught her that sometimes the only way to fix something that was truly broken was to tear it down to its component parts. The consortium was a machine, a big, white, sterile machine, and Anya Sharma, the Junker's daughter from the forgotten moon at the edge of nowhere, was about to show them what happens when you push a scavenger into a corner. She was going to take their junk, their forgotten refuse, and she was going to build a weapon. The low hum of the substation was soon joined by a new sound, the rising, angry whine of a fusion core coming to life for the first time in half a century. The stray dog was waking up, and it wasn't singing a lullaby. It was screaming. The belly of the stray dog was a cacophony of groaning metal and sparking wires. A symphony of decay Anya was trying to conduct into a war song. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was the ship's heart. Her own nervous system fused with the corroded circuits and patched conduits around her. She felt the shiver of the overtaxed life support, the arthritic grind of the docking clamps retracting, the deep, guttural thrum of the fusion core as it burned hotter than its designers had ever intended. Every protest from the old tug was a spike of pain in her own gut. On the bridge, which was little more than a cramped cockpit with a viewport already spiderwebbed with microfractures, Vance stood with his feet planted wide, his knuckles white as he gripped a support strut. He wasn't looking at the dozen scared, determined faces crammed in behind him. He was staring at the raw data streaming across a salvaged monitor Anya had bolted to the wall. It was a countdown, not to their attack, but to the ship's inevitable, catastrophic failure. Listen up. Vance's voice cut through the noise, a blade of gravel and resolve. There are no heroes on this ship. There are no medals waiting for us. There is only the job. Anya gets us in range and turns that tether into a can opener. We hit them. We break them. We grab who we can. And we get out. We do not stop. We do not hesitate. If the person next to you falls, you step over them and you keep moving. The Vord think we are numbers on a spreadsheet. We are here to show them what a rounding error can do. Any questions? Silence was his answer. The question wasn't what to do. It was whether any of them would live through it. Anya gave a sharp nod over the comm, her hands flying across a makeshift control panel she'd built from scavenged parts. The manual thrusters, crude and unresponsive, bucked under her touch. Guiding the stray dog out of the hidden bay was like trying to thread a needle in an earthquake, but she knew the ship's weight. The dead spot in the port side inertial dampener, the way it listed when the main drive spiked. She coaxed it, bullied it, sweet-talked it through the narrow ice tunnels and into the silent, unforgiving void. For a moment, they were just another piece of floating debris in Neptune's shadow. Below them, Lowell City was a dead thing, its lights extinguished, its hum silenced, replaced by the cold, efficient glow of the Vord's mining beams that had already begun to slice into the moon's surface. The rage in Anya's chest solidified into a cold, dense weight. The orbital station, the processing hub, was a thing of obscene beauty, a perfect silver ring adorned with glowing blue lights. It rotated with a hypnotic, celestial grace. It was a monument to order, a temple of bureaucracy. As they drifted closer, hiding their approach behind a small, rogue ice asteroid, they could see the traffic, a constant, silent stream of white dropships ferrying their human cargo from the moon to the station, and larger, featureless transport vessels departing from the station's core, their destinations unknown. They're not even scanning for threats, Vance muttered, his voice laced with contempt. Why would they? The inventory is already secured. Anya's fingers tightened on the controls. The plan was simple and insane. The station's prisoner intake bay was a massive, unshielded maw on the inner side of the ring. They would approach it as if they were another piece of debris, then, at the last moment, unleash hell. We're in the final approach corridor, she announced, her voice strained. The tug was starting to shake violently, the overloaded power core screaming a high-pitched protest that vibrated through the deck plates. Power to the tether coil is at 900%. The magnetic containment is starting to buckle. Hold it together. Sharma, Vance grunted. Just a little longer. I'm not the one you need to convince. She shot back, sweat stinging her eyes. The ship felt like a bomb about to go off in her hands. She could see the intake bay now, a vast, cavernous opening. Inside, she could make out the sterile white platforms where humans were being unloaded, tagged, and sorted by silent, gliding auditors. She saw a flash of red on one of the figures, a child's coat, and the cold weight in her chest ignited. Now, Anya, light them up. Anya slammed her palm down on the activation stud, a crude, oversized button she'd salvaged from an emergency smelter. It wasn't a firing solution. It was an execution. She closed her eyes and diverted every last watt of power from the straining core directly into the magnetic tether projector. The stray dog screamed, not the whine of an engine, but a deep, structural shriek of tortured metal. The lights on the bridge flickered and died, plunging them into darkness lit only by the red glow of emergency alerts. A wave of electromagnetic force, a raw, invisible fist of pure energy, erupted from the front of the tug. It was not a beam of light or a bolt of plasma. It was a silent, violent distortion of space itself. The Vord processing station, a marvel of advanced engineering, had no defense against something so primitive, so brute force. The magnetic wave hit the edge of the intake bay and tore it apart. Metal warped and ripped like paper. The elegant, rotating ring buckled. Its perfect symmetry shattered. Automated drones and cargo containers were ripped from their moorings and flung into the spinning chaos. The wave propagated inwards, shredding infrastructure, overloading power systems, and turning the station's sterile order into a maelstrom of destruction on the bridge of the stray dog. The lights flickered back on. The forward viewport was a mosaic of shattered plasteel, but through the cracks, they could see the result of their one desperate shot. The station was wounded, bleeding atmosphere and debris into the void. Alarms, Vord alarms, finally began to blare across the local comm channels, a chorus of confused, synthetic panic. It's not enough, Vance snarled. They'll recover. Ram them. Anya didn't hesitate. She jammed the main thruster controls forward. The dying ship, its spine broken by the energy discharge, gave one last, shuddering lurch. It careened through the cloud of debris and slammed nose first into the mangled remains of the intake bay. The impact was a grinding, bone-jarring cataclysm. They were no longer a ship. They were a battering ram. A rusted iron spike driven into the heart of the Vord's sterile machine. Vance was already at the airlock, his face set like granite. Breach and clear. We're not here to hold ground. We're here to make ghosts go. The airlock door blew outwards with a concussive bang. The inside of the station was a scene from a nightmare. Gravity was intermittent, flickering on and off as the station's systems failed. Bodies, both human and Vord, drifted in the zero-G moments, suspended in clouds of frozen vapor and sparks. The auditors, for the first time, seemed to lose their placid calm. They moved to intercept the intruders, their silver batons humming, but they were designed for crowd control, for enforcing compliance, not for a savage. Close quarters firefight. Vance and his small team of miners and geologists met them with a fury born of absolute despair. They weren't soldiers. They fought dirty. A geologist swung a heavy rock hammer, shattering the helmet of an auditor with a sickening crunch. A miner discharged a cutting torch into the chest of another. They used their tools, their fists, anything they could find. Anya moved with them, not as a fighter, but as a saboteur. While Vance's team created a bloody perimeter, she scrambled towards a flickering control terminal. Her job wasn't just to free the prisoners, but to cripple the machine. Her fingers flew across the alien interface, not trying to hack it, but to destroy it. She overloaded the station's internal atmospheric controls, routing explosive gases into the ventilation systems. She triggered emergency purges in unoccupied sectors, venting them to the void. She was turning the station against itself, sowing chaos in the code. They reached the main holding pens, vast, tiered chambers where thousands of humans were caged in glowing energy fields, their faces blank with the shock and terror of what was happening. Vance didn't waste time with speeches. He shot the main power conduit for the cages, and the energy fields collapsed. "Move," he roared, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Get to the breached ship now." For a moment, the prisoners just stared, a sea of confused, terrified faces. Then one person, a woman with the haunted eyes of a mother who'd had her child stolen, began to run. Her movement broke the spell, and a flood of humanity surged toward the opening they had created. The escape was a running battle through the dying station. The Vord were adapting, their security drones appearing in greater numbers, their movements becoming more coordinated. Anya and Vance's small group fought a desperate rearguard action, trading their lives for seconds, buying time for the unarmed civilians to escape. The young geologist who had been shaking in the substation took a plasma bolt to the chest, his last act to push a group of children towards the airlock. Vance himself moved like a demon, his pulse rifle a constant, barking roar, laying down a wall of suppressive fire. Anya, her own pistol empty, found an auditor's energy baton and discovered, with a grim satisfaction, that its humming field could just as easily shatter Vord armor as it could stun a human. They stumbled back into the stray dog, dragging the last of the freed prisoners with them. The ship was a wreck, its forward sections completely caved in, its systems screaming a final, dying lament. Anya scrambled to the bridge, vaulting over the bodies of two of her crew who hadn't survived the initial impact. "Seal the airlock," she yelled into the comm, her voice raw. The viewport showed only the chaos of the ruined station, but Vord's security craft, small, wasp-like fighters, were beginning to swarm from other, undamaged parts of the ring. "We're not going anywhere." Vance's voice came back, heavy with exhaustion and pain. "The main drive is slag." "I don't need the main drive," Anya snarled, her eyes wild. She strapped herself into the pilot's chair, her hands finding the manual controls by touch alone. She rerouted the last dregs of power from life support, from internal gravity, from everything but the thrusters and the tether projector. I just need a push. She aimed the magnetic tether not at a ship, but at a huge chunk of the station's hull that had been torn free in the initial blast, a piece of debris the size of a small building. The beam lashed out, weaker this time, but it held. With a groaning protest, the stray dog began to pull itself away from the station, using the wreckage as an anchor to slingshot itself out into open space. It was a mad, impossible maneuver, a trick a salvager might use to move a dead ship in a scrapyard. As they accelerated away, leaving the burning, fractured ring of the processing hub behind them, Anya looked at the faces of the people they had saved. They were huddled in the cargo bay, their faces a mixture of terror and dawning, unbelievable hope. They had lost their homes, their world, their future, but they were alive, and they were free. The stray dog, now little more than a tomb adrift in the dark, had done its job. They had kicked the anthill. They had shown the sterile, orderly Vord consortium that humanity was not just an asset to be liquidated. They were an error in the calculation, a bug in the system, and they had just begun to spread. The silence on the bridge was broken only by the hiss of a failing oxygen recycler and the faint, triumphant crackle of Vord communications descending into chaos. They were wounded, bleeding, and lost in the dark. But for the first time since the white ships had arrived, Anya Sharma allowed herself a single, sharp, predatory smile. The silence of deep space was a liar. It wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. The ghost of the stray dog groaned around them, a chorus of stressed metal and failing systems. The ghosts of their dead crewmates were silent presences in the dark corridors, their faces etched into Anya's memory, and the ghosts of their past lives on Triton haunted the rescued, who huddled together in the cold cargo bay, their eyes wide with the trauma of their sudden, violent liberation. They had traded one cage for another, a sterile, orderly prison for a dying, drifting one. The ship was a corpse, kept moving by Anya's sheer, stubborn will. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. She lived on adrenaline and recycled water, her body a mere extension of the tug's failing machinery. She was a scavenger again, but now she was scavenging moments, stealing seconds from the ship's inevitable death. She'd managed to rig a crude solar sail from the ship's outer plating, a desperate patchwork quilt of metal that caught the faint, distant light of the sun, providing just enough power to keep the most basic life support running. They were moving, but not with purpose. They were falling. A slow, controlled tumble through the outer dark of the solar system. Vance found her in what was left of the engine room, her hands deep in the guts of a power conduit, her face illuminated by the shower of sparks from her plasma welder. He was limping, a makeshift brace on his leg, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. He held out a nutrient paste packet. "Eat," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Anya didn't look up. No time. The primary coolant line is leaking. If it freezes, the core will go critical. Then we'll die warm, Vance said, his tone flat. He set the packet down beside her. We saved 312 people. Anya, they're scared. They're hungry. They're looking to us. They need to see a leader, not just a ghost in the machine. You're the leader, she muttered, her weld sputtering. You know how to fight. I know how to break things. Vance corrected, his voice softer now. You know how to build, how to make something out of nothing. That's what they need now. Not a weapon. A future. His words hit her harder than any plasma bolt. A future. She had been so focused on the fight, on the rage, on the tearing down, that she hadn't dared to think about what came next. She looked at her hands, stained with grease and coolant. The knuckles scraped raw. These were the hands that had built a weapon from junk. Could they build a home from the wreckage? She finally took the nutrient paste, the synthetic, tasteless protein, a bitter reminder of their reality. As she ate, Vance spread a star chart across a crate. It was an old paper one, a relic from his security days. "We can't stay here," he said, his finger tracing a path through the asteroid belt. "The Vord will be hunting us. They took a hit, but they're not broken. They'll send a reclamation team. They're bureaucrats. And we're an unaccounted-for asset. They hate loose ends." "There's nowhere to go," Anya said, her voice hollow. "Earth is gone. Mars is a fortress. The belt is full of pirates and scavengers who'd sell us for a tank of air." Vance's finger stopped on a small, insignificant dot, a place marked only by a string of numbers and the designation Ceres. The dwarf planet, once a bustling mining hub, had been abandoned for decades after the corporations had stripped it of all valuable resources. It was a ghost town, a hollowed-out rock left to the void. "Exactly," Vance said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time. "It's a forgotten scrap heap, a place for junk. Sounds like home, doesn't it?" The journey to Ceres was a slow, agonizing crawl. The stray dog was dying a death of 1,000 cuts. Every few hours, another system would fail, and Anya and a small team of volunteers would have to perform frantic, zero-G repairs on the hull, their movements clumsy in the bulky, patched-up EVA suits. But something was changing among the survivors. The initial shock was giving way to a quiet, grim determination. They were a tribe now, forged in fire and bound by a shared trauma. A former hydroponics technician started a makeshift garden in the cargo bay, using salvaged nutrient lights and recycled water to coax tiny green shoots from a handful of seeds she had carried in her pocket. A teacher gathered the children and began to tell them stories, not of the past, but of a future they would build together. They were no longer just prisoners. They were pioneers. Anya found her role shifting. She was still the chief engineer, the only one who could truly speak the ship's dying language. But now she was also a teacher. She gathered the mechanically inclined, the curious, the desperate, and began to show them what she knew. She taught them how to read a machine's hum, how to splice a power cable, how to coax life from dead technology. She was passing on the legacy of her father, the junker's wisdom, turning scavengers into creators. They arrived at Ceres not with a triumphant roar, but with a tired, shuddering sigh. The dwarf planet was a pockmarked, silent sphere of gray dust and rock. From orbit, it looked dead. But as they got closer, Anya's salvage sensors picked up a faint, intermittent energy signature. It was old, weak, and non-Vord. "Someone's here," she announced over the comm, her voice tight with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Following the signal, they guided the dying tug into a massive, cavernous canyon that had been artificially carved into the planet's surface. And there, nestled deep within the rock, they found it. It wasn't a city, but a scrapyard. A vast and sprawling graveyard of derelict ships. a collection of forgotten vessels from a dozen different human factions, all lashed together into a makeshift zero-G habitat. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of hulls and bridges and engine blocks, all interconnected by a web of pressurized tunnels and external gantries. This was the Boneyard, home to the outcasts, the pirates, the deserters, and the forgotten of the solar system. Their arrival was met with suspicion. Ships, bristling with improvised weapons, detached from the main cluster and moved to intercept them. A voice, gravelly and distorted by a cheap comm system, hailed them. "You're Vord bait. Drifters. State your purpose, or we'll turn your rust bucket into confetti." Vance took the comm. "We're not Vord bait. We're the bite. We're looking for a place to dock and repair." He told them their story. A clipped, concise report of the attack on Triton and the liberation of the processing hub. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the voice came back. A different tone now. A note of grudging respect. Anyone who puts a dent in those white-suited bastards is welcome to a patch of rock. But parts and power aren't free. "What's your trade? We have people." Anya cut in, stepping forward. 300 engineers, doctors, geologists, and farmers. We have the schematics for Vord drone technology we salvaged from the station. And we have her. She gestured to the dying hulk of the stray dog. She's got a Series 4 magnetic tether projector. I can make it work again. The mention of the tether coil seemed to change everything. There was another, longer pause, and then the voice returned, this time with a formal docking invitation. "Bring your people in. We'll talk." The leader of the Boneyard was a woman named Kaylin, a former Martian fleet officer who had deserted after her command refused to engage the Vord, citing a policy of non-aggression. She was tall, scarred, with cybernetic eyes that glowed a soft, cold blue. She ran the Boneyard not as a pirate queen, but as the pragmatic CEO of a scavenger collective. "Your attack was loud," Kaylin said, as she, Anya, and Vance sat in her command center, a repurposed bridge from a massive, old Earth freighter. The main viewport looked out over the controlled chaos of the scrapyard. "The Vord are broadcasting your ship's signature across the system. They've classified you as a rogue bioasset and put a reclamation bounty on you." "Let them come," Vance growled. "We're done running." "Good," Kaylin said, a thin, dangerous smile on her face. "Because we're done hiding." She explained that the Boneyard was more than just a haven for outcasts. It was the heart of a fledgling resistance. They had been fighting a shadow war against the Vord for months, hitting their supply lines, sabotaging their automated mining rigs, and rescuing who they could. But their actions were pinpricks. They lacked the power to land a real blow. "Your magnetic tether," Kaylin said, her blue eyes fixed on Anya. "You weaponized it. That's a game changer. Vord shields are designed to deflect energy and kinetic weapons. They have no defense against raw, brute force magnetism. If you can rebuild that weapon and teach my people how to build more, you've just given us a sword." Anya looked from Kaylin's intense gaze to Vance's steady one. A future. This was it. Not a quiet life in a rebuilt settlement, but a future forged in the heart of a scrapyard, building weapons from junk, fighting a war for the soul of the system. It was the only future that made sense anymore. "I can do it," Anya said, her voice clear and strong. "But I'll need a workshop. and every piece of salvageable coil and capacitor you have." Kalen's smile widened. "Welcome to the Resistance. Sharma, you're home." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The people of the Stray Dog were integrated into the Boneyard's chaotic society. Their skills were invaluable. The doctors set up a proper medbay. The geologists helped identify new resource veins within Ceres. And the farmers, with their precious seeds, began to work with Kalen's engineers to design a sustainable hydroponic system that could feed them all. Anya was given her own workshop, a massive, cavernous hangar bay filled with the corpses of dead ships. It was a salvager's paradise. With a team of boneyard engineers and her own apprentices from Triton, she began to work. She didn't just rebuild the tether projector, she perfected it. She designed a smaller, more focused version that could be mounted on the boneyard's small, nimble fighter craft. They called it the Can Opener. It was a crude, ugly, and devastatingly effective weapon. While she worked, Vance and Kalen planned. They pooled their intelligence, their resources, their rage. The Vord were tightening their grip on the system. They had established processing hubs on Mars and the moons of Jupiter. They were stripping the planets of their resources with terrifying efficiency. But they had a weakness. Their entire operation was automated, coordinated by a central command Nexus, a massive data hub that processed every piece of information, every order, every resource manifest. It was the brain of their system-wide machine, and it was located in a heavily defended orbital station above Venus. "It's a fortress," Kalen said, pointing to a holographic display of the station. "Their entire fleet is protecting it." "Fortresses are just bigger cages," Vance countered. "And we have the key." He looked at Anya, who was leaning over the display, her mind already dissecting the station structure, looking for a weakness, a seam, a place where a brute force magnetic weapon could tear it open. The girl who had just wanted to keep the past running was gone. In her place was a weaponsmith, an architect of rebellion. The hum of the boneyard was different from the hum of Triton. It wasn't the sound of maintenance. It was the sound of creation. It was the whine of plasma cutters shaping new hulls, the clang of hammers on armor plate, the low, powerful thrum of charging magnetic coils. It was the sound of junk being reborn as defiance. It was the sound of a storm gathering in the dark. The storm broke over Venus. It wasn't a fleet that descended upon the Vord command Nexus. It was a swarm. 100 ships, none of them larger than a frigate. All of them cobbled together nightmares of salvaged parts and raw, desperate ingenuity. They were the Boneyard's children, the mongrel fleet of the Resistance. And they moved not in elegant formation, but with the chaotic, unpredictable fury of a hornet's nest that had just been kicked. Anya was in the cockpit of the Tin Man, a heavily modified asteroid hauler that served as the fleet's flagship. It was ugly, asymmetrical, and bristling with the weapons she had designed. Its primary weapon, a massive, spinal-mounted version of her can opener, hummed with a barely contained power that made her teeth ache. Beside her, Kalen commanded the fleet, her cybernetic eyes processing 1,000 streams of data, her voice a calm, cold anchor in the storm of comms chatter. "All wings, scatter formation Gamma," Kalen ordered, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Draw their fire. We're not trying to outgun them. We're trying to confuse them. Remember the plan. We're not the blade. We're the distraction. Anya is the blade." The Vord response was immediate and overwhelming. Their ships, the same bone-white sterile designs that had haunted Anya's nightmares, moved with a perfect, synchronized grace. They formed a defensive sphere around the command Nexus, a massive, crystalline structure that hung in the corrosive yellow clouds of Venus like a malevolent jewel. Lasers, precise and silent, lanced out from the Vord ships, carving through the Boneyard's fleet. A small fighter, the Junker's Luck, vanished in a silent flash of light. Another, a converted ore freighter, lost its engines and began a slow, fiery death spiral into the planet's atmosphere. The cost was brutal, but it was expected. This was a war of attrition, and humanity had always been good at bleeding. "They're falling for it." Vance's voice crackled over the comm. He was leading the fighter wings, his small, nimble ship, the Gnat, weaving through the laser fire like a madman. "They're treating us like a conventional fleet. They're trying to establish a firing line." "Their mistake," Kaelin murmured, her eyes never leaving the tactical display. "Anya, your window is opening. On my mark." Anya's hands were slick on the controls. The Tin Man was a beast, slow and unresponsive, but it was tough. Its hull was a patchwork of armor plating scavenged from a dozen different warships, and it could take a beating. It was taking one now. Energy blasts scoring deep, glowing wounds across its armored hide. She ignored the proximity alarms, the damage reports, the screams of her own ship's tortured metal. Her focus was narrowed to a single point, the command Nexus. It was a thing of perfect, arrogant design. Its systems shielded against every known form of electronic and energy-based attack. But it was a machine, and Anya knew machines. It had to have a weakness, a flaw in its perfection, and she had found it. It wasn't a physical vulnerability, but a logical one. The Nexus was the brain, and it had to be connected to the body. A massive, shielded data conduit ran from the station's core to a relay tower on its dorsal side, the point from which it broadcast its orders to the entire Vord fleet. It was the system's spinal cord. "Mark," Kaelin's voice was sharp. A command and a release. Anya slammed the firing controls forward. The Tin Man shuddered as the massive magnetic coil on its spine discharged. There was no sound, no flash of light, just a ripple in the fabric of space, a silent, invisible wave of raw force that lanced out towards the Nexus. The Vord ships, focused on the swarm of smaller fighters, didn't even see it coming. The magnetic pulse hit the relay tower, and the station reacted as if it had been struck by a physical blow. The tower, designed to be indestructible, simply tore itself apart, its components repelling each other with catastrophic force. The data conduit ruptured, and a fountain of blue energy, the raw data of the Vord's command structure, bled out into the void. The effect on the Vord fleet was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was like cutting the strings on a marionette. The perfect, synchronized sphere of ships faltered. Some stopped dead in space. Others continued on their last heading, firing blindly. A few even began to fire on each other, their targeting systems corrupted by the data surge. The brain was dead, and the body was convulsing. "All wings, push forward!" Vance roared over the comm, a wild, triumphant laugh in his voice. "Break them for Triton for Earth." The Boneyard's fleet, battered and bleeding, surged into the heart of the disorganized Vord formation. It was no longer a battle. It was a slaughter. The resistance fighters, who had been fighting a desperate, defensive war for months, were finally unleashed. They tore into the confused Vord ships with a savage fury, their improvised weapons and dirty tactics proving devastating against an enemy that had forgotten how to think for itself. On the bridge of the Tin Man, Anya watched the chaos unfold, a cold, grim satisfaction settling in her chest. She had done it. She had broken the machine. But the fight wasn't over. A new signal appeared on her tactical display, a single, massive energy signature accelerating towards them from the dark side of Venus. It was a Vord ship, but it was unlike any they had seen before. It was black, not white, a shard of obsidian that seemed to drink the light around it, and it was moving with a purpose the other ships now lacked. It was ignoring the main battle, its course set directly for them. "Kalen," Anya said, her voice low. "We've got a problem." Kalen's cybernetic eyes widened as she saw the new contact. "That's not a warship," she breathed. "That's an administrator-class vessel. It's a command ship, a thinking ship." The black ship hailed them, not with a broadcast, but with a direct, encrypted link that bypassed their firewalls as if they weren't there. A voice filled the bridge, the same calm, synthesized, genderless tone that had announced the audit of the Sol system. But this time, it was not placid. It was cold. Cold with the fury of a perfect system that had just been corrupted. Rogue bio-asset identified. The voice stated, "Your classification has been updated from spoilage to contaminant. The designated course of action is sterilization." The black ship accelerated, its prow glowing with a terrifying, white-hot energy. It wasn't firing a laser, it was preparing to ram them, its entire hull converted into a single, planet-cracking weapon. Evasive maneuvers, Kalen yelled, but it was too late. The Tin Man was too slow, too damaged. The black ship was a spear, and they were its target. They were going to die. But Anya Sharma was a junker's daughter, and she had one last piece of scrap to throw into the fire. Her eyes darted to a secondary control panel, one she had installed herself, a system that no one, not even Kalen, knew about. It was a direct link to the Tin Man's most dangerous and unstable component, its fusion core. Her father had taught her that every machine has a soul, a heart that gives it life, and sometimes the only way to save the body is to make the heart explode. "Vance," she said into the comm, her voice surprisingly calm. "Get the fleet out of here. Take the rescued. Go back to Ceres. Build something that lasts." "Anya, what are you doing?" Vance's voice was sharp with alarm. "Ending it," she said. She looked at Kalen, whose face was a mixture of horror and dawning understanding. "It's been an honor," Anya said, and she gave the Martian a small, tired smile. Then she cut the comm. Her fingers flew across the panel, bypassing every safety protocol, every fail-safe. She was a saboteur again, but this time, the machine she was destroying was her own. She linked the navigation system to the core's containment field. The ship's final act would be to guide its own detonation. The black ship was almost upon them, a wall of obsidian and white-hot energy filling the viewport. The Tin Man began to glow, a deep, angry red light pulsing from within. Anya didn't close her eyes. She watched the administrator ship approach. This perfect, sterile instrument of a bureaucratic empire. She thought of her father's hands, of the hum of Triton, of the screams of the children in the processing hub. The Vord had called her a contaminant, a bug in their perfect system, and she was about to show them what a virus could do. The last thing Anya Sharma saw was a flash of impossible, cleansing white light. The Tin Man detonated, its fusion core, stripped of all containment, went critical in a single, silent, incandescent heartbeat. It was not an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but a release of pure, raw energy, the dying scream of a small, man-made star. The blast wave caught the administrator ship at point-blank range. The black vessel, a marvel of Vord engineering, designed to withstand the rigors of deep space and the fury of conventional warfare, had no defense against the heart of a sun being unleashed in its face. It didn't explode. It simply ceased to exist. It was sublimated, its every atom torn apart and scattered into the solar wind. The shock wave rolled outwards, a silent, expanding sphere of light and death. It caught the edges of the fighting, Vord and human ships alike being tossed about like leaves in a hurricane. But the battle was already over. The Vord fleet, leaderless and broken, had lost its will. Some ships began to drift aimlessly. Others, their systems fried, began the long, slow fall into Venus's crushing embrace. Across the scattered remnants of the Boneyard's fleet, there was only silence. They had won. The brain was dead. The fist was shattered. But the cost was a hole in the universe where their best and brightest had just been. Vance, his fighter drifting amidst the wreckage, stared at the expanding nebula of light that had once been the Tin Man. He couldn't speak. There were no words. There was only the ghost of a promise he had to keep. Build something that lasts. The war wasn't over. The Vord were a vast interstellar empire. This was just one system, one victory. But it was a start. It was a message, written in the fire of a dying star. It said that humanity was no longer an asset on a spreadsheet. They were a contagion, and they were spreading. Back on Ceres, in the heart of the Boneyard, 1,000 tiny green shoots were pushing their way up through recycled soil, reaching for the light of a salvaged sun. The light from Anya's sacrifice reached Ceres a week later, not as a flash, but as a story. Vance and the tattered remnants of the fleet returned not to a hero's welcome, but to a silent, solemn gathering in the Boneyard's central cavern. They brought with them the truth of the victory at Venus, a victory paid for with the life of the woman who had made it possible. There were no statues raised in her name, no grand speeches. Her memorial was the quiet, determined hum of the scrapyard getting back to work. Her legacy was in the hands of every engineer who now knew how to build a can opener, in the minds of every pilot who now knew that the Vord could bleed, and in the heart of every child who would now grow up in a world where humanity fought back. The fall of the Sol Command Nexus sent a tremor through the Vord consortium, but it did not break it. The consortium was a vast Edisite galaxy-spanning bureaucracy, and the loss of a single remote system was, to the higher echelons of its administration, an acceptable write-off. They had lost assets, but the ledger was vast. They updated their protocols, reclassified humanity from a contaminant to a Tier 7 hostile indigenous species, and authorized a fleet for planetary sterilization. But bureaucracy, for all its efficiency, is slow. And in the time it took for the Vord to process the paperwork for humanity's extinction, the fire Anya had lit began to spread. The Boneyard became a beacon. Ships began to arrive, first in a trickle, then in a flood. They were deserters from the Earth and Mars Defense Forces, which had largely stood by while the Vord consumed the outer planets. They were independent miners and traders whose livelihoods had been liquidated. They were the survivors of other, smaller outposts that had been audited and stripped. They came with stories of horror and loss, but they also came with ships, with skills, with a burning, shared hatred for the sterile white efficiency of the Vord. Ceres was no longer a scrapyard. It was a capital of a rebellion that didn't even have a name yet. Vance, thrust into a leadership role he never wanted, found himself at the head of a growing war council. Kaylin, her face now permanently etched with a grim, cold fury, became his master strategist. They worked, not to build an empire, but to build a wildfire. Their strategy was simple and brutal, born from Anya's philosophy: don't fight their fleet, fight their system. They didn't engage the Vord in open battle. They hit their supply lines, their automated resource refineries, their communication relays. They used the can openers not to destroy warships, but to tear open cargo haulers, spilling billions of credits worth of processed materials into the void. They turned the Vord's greatest strength, their reliance on a perfectly ordered, automated system, into their greatest weakness. Every disrupted shipment, every destroyed mining drone was a line of red ink on the Vord's ledger. They were making the occupation of the Sol system unprofitable. Vance led many of the raids himself. He was no longer just a security chief from a forgotten moon. He was the ghost of Sol. His name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence across the captured system. He fought with a cold, precise rage. Every victory a bitter tribute to the woman who had shown him how to fight. He never spoke of Anya, but her presence was a constant shadow at his side. He pushed his crews, his ships, and himself to the breaking point, fueled by a grief that had curdled into a relentless, unforgiving purpose. He was no longer trying to build a future, he was trying to burn down the present. The turning point came a year after the Battle of Venus. The Vord sterilization fleet finally arrived. A perfect, gleaming armada of 50 warships. Their purpose, the simple, bureaucratic task of erasing humanity from the system. But the Sol system they found was not the one they had left. The Resistance, now calling themselves the Free Sons of Sol, had not been idle. The asteroid belt had been turned into a vast, interconnected fortress. Every major rock was a hidden base, a missile silo, a fighter hangar. They had laid minefields of salvaged magnetic coils, designed to tear Vord ships apart the moment they entered the belt. When the Vord fleet arrived, they were not met by a line of battle, but by 1,000 ambushes. The battle for the belt was a meat grinder. The Free Sons bled, losing ships and lives at a horrific rate. But for every ship they lost, they took 2 of the Vords. They fought like cornered animals, with a ferocity that the Vord, who viewed warfare as a simple matter of asset allocation, could not comprehend. Kaylin orchestrated the defense from Ceres, a grim puppet master pulling the strings of her chaotic, suicidal fleet. She sacrificed wings of fighters to draw the Vord into kill zones, sent lone, heavily armed freighters on suicide runs to ram Vord command ships, and used the very asteroids themselves as kinetic weapons, launching them on collision courses with the enemy fleet. In the heart of the battle, Vance was a whirlwind of destruction. His squadron, the Stray Dogs, flew in the memory of their first, lost ship. They targeted the Vord's logistical ships, their repair drones, their fuel tankers. They weren't just fighting the enemy, they were starving them, blinding them, leaving them stranded in a sea of hostile rock and vengeful humans. The battle lasted for 3 weeks. It was a brutal, bloody testament to humanity's refusal to be erased. In the end, the Vord sterilization fleet was broken. Less than a third of its ships managed to limp away, their perfect white hulls blackened and scarred, their mission a catastrophic failure. The cost to the Vord was not just military, it was economic. The loss of a full sterilization fleet, the continued disruption of resource extraction, the sheer, stubborn expense of trying to subdue a species that refused to be a compliant asset had finally tipped the scales on their balance sheet. The Vord did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They simply left. One day, their remaining ships and processing hubs just disengaged and jumped out of the system, their departure as silent and emotionless as their arrival. The audit was over. The Sol system was no longer a profitable venture. It had been written off. The silence they left behind was heavier than the one they had shattered. Humanity was free, but it was also broken. Earth was a shell. Mars was a ghost town, and the outer planets were scarred by the Vord's strip mining operations. They were the masters of a ruined house, but it was their house, on Ceres, in the heart of what was now the capital of a free, if shattered, solar system. Vance stood in the first large-scale hydroponics bay, a vast cavern filled with the green, vibrant life that had been nurtured from a handful of seeds. The air was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the cold, recycled air of the rest of the boneyard. Children, born during the war, who had never known anything but the gray of metal and rock, ran through the rows of plants, their laughter echoing in the vast chamber. Kaylin stood beside him, her cybernetic eyes, once cold and hard, now reflecting the green of the leaves. She would have liked this, Kaylin said quietly. Vance didn't need to ask who she meant. He reached out and touched a leaf. The living, organic texture, a strange and wonderful thing against his calloused, scarred fingers. "We did it, Anya," he whispered to the ghosts and the silence. "We built something that lasts." The hum of the boneyard had changed again. It was no longer the sound of maintenance or the sound of war. It was the sound of life, the sound of air circulators feeding a garden, of water pumps irrigating fields, of children learning in makeshift schools. It was the sound of a future being built, not from grand designs and perfect schematics, but from junk, from scrap, from the broken pieces of what had been. Humanity had been audited and found wanting. They had been deemed spoilage, a rounding error in a galactic ledger, but they had learned a valuable lesson. A lesson taught to them by a junker's daughter from a forgotten moon. They learned that when a system is corrupt, when the machine is designed to grind you into dust, the only logical, sane, and honorable thing to do is to break it. They had looked into the cold, placid face of bureaucratic oblivion, and they had spit in its eye. They were scavengers. They were survivors. And they were finally, truly, home.